Thank you. All right. So nice intimate group here today. I guess I should have been more provocative in my description of what I'll be talking about, but I can be provocative. How many people in here, just curious, have been to a presentation of mine before? A few of you? Okay. All right. Fair warning, I may rant a time or two today. I've been advised that I should be less provocative than sometimes I've been in the past, but we'll see how that goes. At any rate, so how many of you, even if you haven't been to one of my presentations, are familiar with sort of my work and what I focus on? You know, almost half, right? For those who don't know, I've been in technology and information security for over 30 years and been a CISO for 3 different companies for about 10 years. But the last 17 years have been focused on trying to understand risk in our domain and measure it quantitatively in dollars and cents. And if you've heard of the framework called FAIR, or Factor Analysis of Information Risk, that's something I began developing in 2001. And we'll touch on that a little bit here. But really, my point is, over the years, and especially in recent years, as our industry begins to get on board with this notion of quantification, I continually run into concerns, pushback, skepticism, and that sort of thing, especially related to data. So that's something I'll be talking a lot about, trying to dispel those myths and misperceptions and give you a better understanding of sort of the reality around data in our problem space. So without further ado, let's dive in. Okay, so some of this might seem obvious, but there are some, I think, relatively important nuances. So we'll talk about understanding why we want and need data really fundamentally. I think intuitively we might have a sense, but let's explore that a little bit. The nature of cyber-related data, we'll talk about that. There's some, again, some truths from my perspective. The relationship between data and models, those are inseparable in a real sense. Recognize where we can get different types of data. Understand the so what, all right? So we have data, so what? How do we begin to use the data? Gain understanding and insights and so on from data to drive decisions. How to gauge the quality of our data, because that's something, again, I don't think we really spend enough time thinking about. And then some heads up, because as the risk and data side of our profession begins to heat up, you see vendors and articles, research reports and such beginning to focus more on this. And unfortunately, a lot of what's out there is not very well done. And so I'll give you a heads up sort of what to look for there. So why do we want or need data? It's really about uncertainty. I mean, we deal in a very important space, and what we do matters. And we don't like uncertainty about what we do and the things that we advise our stakeholders to do and such. You know, ideally, we would have perfect certainty around that. That's obviously not going to happen, but that's why we want data, because data reduces uncertainty, or can, or should. Right? But here's sort of the reality around our risk landscape. It's dynamic, it's complex, and we have I wish we had unlimited. We have limited resources, which means we have to prioritize. We have to know what to focus on first. Not only that, the things we choose to focus on, we also have to be able to choose the most cost-effective solution. It's not enough that we know, oh, we need to focus on this. We also need to understand which solution choice is going to be most cost-effective, back to that limited resources thing. And prioritization is always a matter of choices. And choices are invariably based on comparisons, and comparisons are always based on measurements, and measurements always involve data, always. So let me ask you this. If someone said, Jack, how much risk does the cloud represent? And I took my finger and waved it in the air, and I said, well, that's medium, or it's high. Is data involved in that measurement? Because that is a measurement. It's not a very high quality measurement. When it comes to measure, I'll say this up front too, something to keep in mind. Our industry is used to a zero cost risk measurement function. It's medium, it's high, it's low. There's no cost there, but you're getting what you pay for in terms of the quality and reliability of those measurements. All right, we'll get into that a little bit more. But even waving a wet finger in there, I'm using data, whatever data is tumbling around inside my head, some blog post I read or some media report or something is informing that statement, okay, some sort of data. Even if it's just, you know, a swag on my part, right, that's still data. Right? So data is always a part of measurement. But it isn't necessarily about how much data, it's about the quality of data. Okay, and here again, that's where I think a lot of people think that, well, if we have enough data, then, you know, then all will be well. We'll talk more about that. But it isn't really about the quantity of data, although more is great if you have it and it's good quality and it's relevant. But it isn't necessarily about more, it's about better, and it's about understanding the quality of whatever data you have. So some of the truths around data. All right, this is a statement that I hear maybe not every day, but a couple times a week probably. I'll hear someone say, well, we don't have enough data to do quantitative measurement of our problem space. And well, I like to ask, well, how much is enough? How much data would you need? You know, maybe I'm talking to a CISO. And I heard a CISO say this exact thing last week. We don't have enough data to measure risk. Okay. So how much data do you need? Well, they don't have a good answer for that, right? Well, it has to be actuarial quality tables, right, before we can really measure it with confidence. Well, back to uncertainty, it's a matter of, even if you had quote-unquote actuarial tables, and we'll touch on that in a second, there's still uncertainty because your data is never complete. It's never perfect. Plus, data, by definition, is historical in nature, and how closely does the past reflect what's likely to happen in the future, particularly in our problem space? Okay, so even if we had some incredibly large table of data, that doesn't mean it solves our problems, so to speak, all right? So on that point, so what do we think the half-life of data in our problem space is? Anybody care to venture a guess with how rapidly things change? Let me prompt you. How about threat capabilities? How rapidly do threat capabilities change in our world? Or the assets in our landscape, the things, the technologies we use, the data we gather, these sorts of things, how rapidly does that change? How about the attack vectors that the bad guys use? Or the control conditions? Or the loss implications, right? Those are all some of the data elements that would have to be in an actuarial table. And they have various half-lives, if you will, in terms of their relevance to our future. So even if we could wave a magic wand and get our profession and the industries we serve to actually share data in order to build a table like this, we'd have this challenge regarding half-life of the data and its ability to really inform us and such. But one thing I want to point out too, that even as problematic as that sounds, we're still having to prioritize. It's like that CISO who says, well, we don't have enough data. I say, well, do you prioritize the stuff on your plate? Well, of course he does. Well, every prioritization is a measurement, is based on measurement. What data are you using, right? He has no leg to stand on, right? He's choosing to use essentially whatever data is tumbling around inside the heads of whoever's rating things high, medium, and low, as well as their uncalibrated mental models, which we'll touch on more in a little bit. He's presuming that's better than a formal model that's calibrated and at least some rigor around data. And he's grotesquely wrong. Okay, so yeah, our situation from a data analytics perspective is challenging, but that doesn't change the fact that we still have to prioritize, we still have to make these decisions, so we should make the best use of the data that we have, and in order to do that, we have to understand some of these truths and characteristics of data in our problem space, okay? One of those things we need to understand is that there's diminishing returns. The 100th data point is not as informative as the first 5 or 10 or however many in terms of understanding whatever it is you're measuring. Right? How many people are familiar with Douglas Hubbard and his work, How to Measure Anything? If you're not familiar with Douglas Hubbard and his book, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk, I recommend that you pick that book up and read it. It's good stuff. And he talks about this sort of thing and a lot of good examples and so on. But he talks about we have more data than we think we do, and that's true. Okay. And the other thing he drives home is we need less data than we think we do to do quantitative analysis. High quality. But don't confuse high quality with precision. It's not about precision and measurement, especially something as dynamic as our problem space. It's about accuracy. And accuracy means if we have crap data, we reflect that through ranges. We don't estimate some parameter with a discrete value. We recognize the uncertainty in it. We represent that as a range. Very often when giving presentations, I'll point to someone in the audience and I'll say, how tall do you think I am? And they'll say, I don't know, 6 foot. I say, will you bet 1,000 of your own dollars on that? And they go, no. And I say, can you give me a range that you would bet your life on? And they might say something like, well, 1 foot to 10 feet tall. What has changed there? They have no better data about my height, but they're able to faithfully express their uncertainty. That's the only difference between not being willing to bet $1,000 and betting their life, is just being able to represent their uncertainty. And that's what we have to do too, because we have challenges with data and measurement. The key to that is dealing with it, representing it as ranges and distributions to reflect our uncertainty. Another point is data regarding our most valuable assets is more important than data not associated with most valuable assets. How many people in here work for an organization where you think, yeah, we pretty much have a handle on what our most valuable assets are and where they are? How many people? Isn't that sad? Not that many people work for organizations that have that. That's common. You're in good company. It's unfortunate. But even those organizations, those of you who feel like your organization probably really doesn't have a good handle on it, you have some understanding. It's not complete, it's not comprehensive, but you have some understanding. And again, you have to make the best use of the data you have, continue to improve your data over time, but recognize that whatever data you have, you need to leverage as effectively as possible. All right? Another argument I'll hear is, well, our data is not comprehensive, so we can't measure cyber risk. Again, they're still prioritizing, so they are measuring. They're just, sweeping all the difficulty, all the challenges under the rug, right? You have data, and so the key is you have to be able to leverage it as effectively as possible. We have a ton of data, back to the title, drowning in data. How many people in here work for organizations that have data scientists and data lakes? A few of you? Oh, actually quite a few, right? So you've got security telemetry and other technology telemetry just dumping data into this huge pool, right? And organizations are now going, holy cow, what do we do with that? All right, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit when I talk about models. But for some things, we have a tremendous amount of data. Now it's a matter of making sense of it. But other parts of our problem space, we have very little data, and that's not likely to change appreciably in the near term. How many people work for organizations? You don't have to raise your hand because that would be bad. How many of you work for organizations that have a ton of data about rogue DBAs doing nasty things to your crown jewels? All right. I haven't run into an organization that is living that reality. But that is certainly a scenario that we have to worry about, that we have to be concerned about, that we have to prioritize against other things in our risk landscape. We don't have great data around that. We hopefully will never have great data around that because that would mean bad things are happening. But we still have to factor that in. We still have to treat that as a measurement. We still have to somehow come up with data around that. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but it really comes down to calibrated subject matter expert estimates. How many people in here have heard of calibrated estimates? A few of you? Homework for the rest? Look up calibrated estimates. If you buy Douglas Hubbard's book on how to measure anything, he talks about calibration. I believe anybody in our profession, let me put it this way. If someone comes to me and says, that risk is medium or high or whatever, and they aren't calibrated, I place no value in their estimate. That's how important I believe it is. So when we think about the data we have and saying, okay, well, really let's examine the quality of that data. And this is what I'm about to show you here, something that was shared with me by Bank of America, who they have some of the best risk measurement, cyber risk measurement people in probably the world, in my opinion, working there. And they came up with this sort of simple way to characterize the quality of data and the uncertainty in it. So for specificity of data, you have data that is highly specific to the problem you're trying to answer, the measurement you're trying to take, or categorical or general. And we'll get into examples of this in a little bit. And then from a data quality, they have hard data, cool. Calibrated estimates, back to what I was mentioning a minute ago, or just wild-ass guesses. And certainly, you want to be living in that lower left corner as much as possible. But again, for parts of our problem space, it's not possible, at least not in the short term. Right? So when you're thinking about it, when you're evaluating, we'll do this in a little bit, when you're looking at your data, thinking about your data with regard to a particular analysis you might be doing, you can think about it in these terms, and that can help you characterize it not only in your own mind, but to the stakeholders you're communicating with. Because if you're, one of the other problems with high, medium, and low measurements is that never includes a statement, at least in my experience, of confidence. How confident, is it really medium, or could it be high? Or could it be low? And why? You know, what part of our measurement is problematic that leaves us with that uncertainty? That's not even part of the conversation when we're doing this. But when you're doing quantitative measurement, it sure should be part of the conversation. But this can allow you, even if you're doing sort of rudimentary qualitative analyses of risk, you can still use this to think through and communicate sort of the quality of the measurement and such to the stakeholders, because they need to know. But even hard data, I mean, people tend to say, well, you know, we need hard data, or we have hard data, yay. Okay, well, not all hard data is created equal. So here's sort of another matrix to characterize that. You know, this is not rigorous or anything like that, but it's a way to think about hard data and recognize that it has two dimensions too in terms of its value. The recency, old data is not going to be as useful generally as more recent data. And the volume of data matters too. Back to this sort of understanding the uncertainty. So don't fool yourselves that hard data is some sort of panacea. It has its own challenges as well. And we have to think again about this. And here's the point. So I would rather rely on a calibrated subject matter expert estimate than bad hard data. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But bottom line is hard data is good when you have it and when it's relevant and such, but it's, again, not by itself is not a panacea. And very often, whatever hard data you have is going to be a mix in terms of its age and relevance and that sort of thing. All right, so we have data, so what? So for example, your organization has umpteen thousand unpatched vulnerabilities. How many people live that reality? You don't have to raise your hand. Okay. A lot of organizations have a lot of unpatched stuff. So what? What decisions, you guys tell me, what decisions might be driven by this so what? Understanding how much you care. Anybody? How about where this stands as a problem relative to everything else the organization faces? Yeah, unpatched stuff, that's a key part of risk management in our problem space in almost any organization. But where does it stand relative to identity and access management or logging or awareness and education around phishing or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Incident response, backup and recovery. You know, we have a ton of things. One of the great things about our problem space is it's not boring. One of the challenges is it's really complex and dynamic. Back to, again, we have to be able to prioritize effectively. If we can't understand the so what behind these unpatched things, what are the odds we're going to prioritize appropriately or effectively? And then even if we do decide that, well, this patching sits number 2 on our list of things, or number 1, which patches? So it's not just a matter of prioritizing amongst the other parts of our domain, it's within the domain or the problem space itself, in this case patching. We have to be able to know what matters most. What do we tend to rely on in our world right now around patching? What is our source of, pains me to say this, wisdom regarding the importance of a patch? Patch Tuesday, yeah. CVSS, right? The tools out there, sometimes, you know, data provided by vendors around their technologies. But how many people in here work for organizations? How many people in here are familiar with CVSS? Now, leave your hand in the air if your organization uses CVSS scores straight out of the box. A few of you. A lot of organizations recognize that CVSS is broken 6 ways from Sunday, but they have to use it because it's baked into everything and it's a de facto standard, despite the fact that it's crap. Did I just rant? I think I just ranted. Sorry about that. I wrote a blog post on the problems with NIST CSF a while back. At any rate, but actually NIST, and I hear people say, well, CVSS is a start, it's better than nothing. Actually, it kind of isn't, okay? Because it provides so much noise that it actually creates confusion and problems maybe as much as solves them, okay? So, you know, we have to be able to. Now, here's the interesting thing about CVSS. The input values to CVSS, the data that it uses as inputs, some of that is really good. And I use it, it's really valuable. It's their math, it's the equations, it's how they analyze it, it's the model in their approach that's broken 6 ways from Sunday. All right? So the input values can be very valuable, the raw data, if you will. It's the interpreted data that's problematic. Speaking of which, raw data, examples of raw data, the number of SQL injection vulnerabilities we might get back from something, the number of malware stopped at the perimeter, right? So we have these data elements, again, that we that we gather, our technologies provide us and such, that's raw data. There is no meaning behind any of that, right? So if someone mentions the word SQL injection, you know, we found this SQL injection, you know, weakness in some application. We, as individuals, take that data, that raw piece of data, and we interpret it in our own little mental models, right? By itself, the information has no value. It's only when we or a model interprets it. And that's true for all raw data. Interpreted data, things like CVSS severity score. Anytime you see a risk score, it's interpreted. Somebody has applied a model to it. It may be a personal model, that feels medium to me, or it might be something baked into a technology. But the thing is, some models are better than others. And if you have a badly broken model, it doesn't matter how good your data is. Back to CVSS, for example, but there are others. And this is the other thing I think people need to keep in mind too is all models are incomplete and imperfect. Just some are less broken than others, right? But we have to understand the limitations of the models. That's why, how many people in here think proprietary encryption is a good thing? Black box, proprietary encryption. Nobody? Why should risk models be any different? If somebody says, well, that's proprietary, you know, how we're analyzing it, me, I run for the hills. If they can't explain it to me, I don't trust it. There's so many ways models can go wrong. I've actually seen one very large financial services organization sold a $300 million security strategy to their board of directors. And the board of directors said, but we want to know how much less risk we're getting out of that. So they came to me and said, can you help us with that? And I said, sure. I said, how did you put together your $300 million strategy? And they said, oh, we have a spreadsheet. And I said, because I looked at their strategy, I was thinking, boy, this doesn't seem right. I said, can I look at your spreadsheet? And they said, sure. And their homegrown model had their priorities exactly upside down. And I asked them, what's your appetite for going back to the board with a revision to your strategy? And I said, none whatsoever, have a nice day. They walked me out the door. And they just waved hands at the board and pressed on. Okay? A lot of broken models out there. How many people are familiar with NIST 800-30? It's their version of a risk. It's broken. Table G5 violates basic laws of probability. Oops. So what's the most commonly used cybersecurity model? I've already mentioned it a couple of times. It's whatever's tumbling around inside of the head of the person who just said, well, this is high risk, or medium risk, or low risk. That is the most common model, measurement model for cybersecurity risk in our industry, with all the challenges that comes with it, the biases, the unexamined assumptions, and so on, right? We don't know what they're thinking. I'm trying to think about how much time I have left. 10 minutes? About 10? Okay, all right. So I'll press along here quickly. So every risk measurement involves two models. First of all, sort of the scope of what's being measured, right? The assets at risk, what threat, what vector, what controls are relevant, what type of event, confidentiality, integrity, availability, those sorts of things, as well as sort of the formula for taking that information and deriving a result. Those two things are part of every measurement. Again, whether it's going on inside here or something a little more formally defined, calibrated, and reviewed. Right? But these are the things, and when people are learning to do risk analysis in our profession, this first part, the scope, that's where they struggle. They don't struggle with sort of terminology and concepts and principles. They aren't used to scoping. They are used to doing the zero-cost risk analysis, quote unquote, that doesn't involve any sort of formal scope. That's where people struggle when they're first learning to do risk analysis. So formal models provide a guide to what data you need, right? And then it provides you a way to use that to get at so what. And it's an expression of your analytic assumptions, which is really important because people need to be able to push back and probe and understand how you got to what you got to. When you start doing real risk analysis and you take the results to management, first couple of times they're going to want to know how you did that. And if you can defend it, you can say, here are assumptions, that sort of thing, they will love you for it. If you can't defend it, it's not going to show well. Okay? And by the way, I hear this, people talk about, well, vendors, and some vendors have, machine learning and so on, that takes the human out of the equation. Baloney. Someone designed the AI. Someone decided what data to feed it and teach it and that sort of thing. So, no. Until we're kind of out of the picture altogether, humans are still involved. So common sources of cyber data. I've talked a little bit about this. Logs, intrusion detection logs. If you're thinking about using intrusion detection logs, that tends to be very specific data around sort of what just transpired, the nature of the threat, the target, the vector, and those sorts of things. So back to this, uncertainty, that tends to be more specific. System logs, things like failed login attempts. It seems like it's specific, and in some senses it is, but we don't necessarily know what would have happened if they got in, right? So we don't know exactly what scenarios to apply that data to in analysis. The bottom line here is that even the telemetry we have, we still have to think about where it fits in the analysis, what the scope of what is the scope of the problem we're trying to analyze, get an answer to, measure risk of, and where that data fits within that. Same with scan results like vulnerability data, and if we chose to use the sort of severity indicators provided by technology and so on. Same with penetration tests. We get the weaknesses that are identified. That's raw data, meaningless until it's interpreted. All right? And who's interpreting it? Typically, the person who did the penetration test, the consultant or whatever. And again, based on what models? Audits, same sort of thing. Control deficiencies, that's raw data. Severity of those is interpreted using models. Someone's model is interpreting the significance of that. Survey assessments around, say, third-party questionnaires, same sort of thing. Threat intelligence, raw data around the activity in the threat landscape and dark web and so on. And TTPs and so on. So some of the sources of data that are out there in our industry, Verizon is one of the best. Verizon DBIR. If you aren't familiar with it, I recommend that you become familiar with it. How many people in here are familiar with Ponemon? Okay, now Ponemon has, depending on who you talk to, you love them or you hate them, okay? Some of their stuff is better than other stuff. You need to be a little careful in how you use it. Scientia, how many people have heard of Scientia? Those who haven't, you should look them up. They have really good stuff. Advisen, the FAIR Institute, which we'll mention here in a minute, and some university studies and research and so on. And eventually the insurance industry will be useful for some data. Today, not so much, but they're working on that. So, I mentioned the subject matter expert estimates. If that's all you have, if you don't have hard data, well, you don't want to have someone just giving wild-ass guesses. Calibrated subject matter expert estimates have been proven study after study to be, very useful and can end up with, high-quality results. But again, they have to be calibrated. I already talked about that. And I mentioned, too, that you still need to represent the uncertainty in the measurements. Incidents. I have yet to run into an organization that really makes good use of the incident data, the incidents that they have from a data perspective. The actual losses, response costs, recovery costs, lost revenue, notification costs, fines and judgments, these sorts of things. Again, organizations don't really leverage the opportunity they have from a data perspective. Data is sort of an afterthought. Threat vectors and control of efficacy and deficiencies involved in an actual incident. Again, these are things that organizations miss. And then root causes, nobody does root cause analysis that I've seen. So a quick example, let's say your latest data shows that 15% of your personnel in your organization are clicking on phishing emails. Oh, and the number of phishing attacks is doubled, or 50% increase over the previous year. All right? So what? Back to, again, data is without meaning. We have to understand it within the context of something we care about, which is the loss events that can transpire. And that drives decisions about where this stands relative to all the other things you have to worry about, as well as your mitigation opportunities, which ones are likely to be most effective. And how many people in here are familiar with FAIR, the Factor Analysis of Information Risk? This model I mentioned earlier. And this is just partial, but the point is, if you use that, you can begin to take data related to your phishing and understand it using sort of this model for uncertainty around data. You say, well, are we interested in general phishing attacks or spear phishing where it looks like when they land, they're actually trying to expand from there versus just trying to get someone's bank account information. These are important distinctions when we're applying our phishing data to the analysis. We have to understand what it is we're trying to get at. Likewise, the probability of user compromise, is it we're talking about all personnel or specific personnel or a group? Again, our phishing data, we probably can get down to some of these details and get much more precision and value out of the data, but we have to think of it in these terms. And then a loss of magnitude. We're worried about compromise of intellectual property in general, if, say, that's what we're concerned about, or is it a specific class of intellectual property or a specific type of loss, say reduction in stock price from these kinds of events? These kinds of details matter when we're trying to actually use the data to understand our world and make good decisions. So very quickly, things to watch out for, because I'm running along here. I've talked about it a little bit. As the industry begins to move more and more to quantification, we talked about quantification in the keynote speech, and a lot of other presentations are going there too. So vendors are going to go there too, and you're going to hear claims that just flat don't stand up. And you should feel, when a vendor walks through the door to tell you about their whiz-bang, risk measurement thing, you should be asking hard questions. What model are they using? What data, what scenarios can they analyze, and which ones aren't they analyzing? You need to understand that in order to gauge the value and the veracity of what they're offering. All right? And keeping in mind that anytime they're scoring risk, whether it's a credit-like score or something else, all right, they're using models. Understand what those are. Okay, one quick thing too, there's a big difference between models and frameworks. These are not risk models, risk measurement models. They are good practice models, very useful, but they aren't measuring risk, because when you find deficiencies through one of these, what happens? Somebody does this and says, well, that feels high, right? Generally. The models, these frameworks themselves aren't measuring risk. Okay, I'm kind of getting ahead of my clicker. Okay, so wrapping up real quickly, we're drowning in some data and we have not very much of other. We have to understand the problems we're trying to solve and how to use the data effectively, whatever data we do have. Because we have to prioritize. And we are prioritizing, but we have to do it better. I argue that our challenges from a risk measurement perspective in our industry are a gift to the bad guys. They have all kinds of inherent advantages anyway. The fact that we don't prioritize well is a gift. Back to ranting, being provocative. Uncertainty is unavoidable. We just have to understand it. We have to understand the quality of our data, represent it effectively, faithfully represent and communicate that uncertainty, and work on improving it. Data models and all this stuff is about reducing uncertainty. It's not going to go away. And quality of data is more important than quantity. And if you're going to wait for enough data, well, good luck with that. And data without models is useless. If your organization wants to really be a data-driven organization, you have to deal with these things. You have to understand your models, you have to understand your data, you have to apply the data appropriately. If you're not, your organization is fooling itself. And when you think about it, you know, it being a data-driven security organization. Some books and other resources, again, the slide deck will be available, or you can contact me. Some really good information there. Next week, please begin looking into some of those resources on the slide prior. First 3 months, here are some things I think be very worthwhile for you to do. And within 6 months, some other things. Again, I apologize for speeding through this, but I'm running long. So, questions. I probably have not much time for questions, but hopefully they'll let me answer a couple. Any questions? Hopefully? Yes, sir.
Where do you see the field of risk management going in 20, 30 years from now?
20, 30 years, they'll look back on this as the dark ages. Honestly, they'll look at how we measure risk today, commonly, you know, that will be the equivalent of bloodletting. I'm serious. Now here's the thing, every discipline that we think of as mature, the sciences and mathematics and that sort of thing, went through an evolutionary growth phase like this too. All right, so this is normal, natural for a professional discipline, but we don't have the time, we don't have the decades or hundreds of years they had to advance because our problem space is evolving way more rapidly. Yes, sir.
I had a question about one of the last slides you had there. Spend the next 3 months doing what I've pretty much made a career out of doing.
Cool.
And that's trying to figure out exactly what information was out there on what equipment. And it goes back to that hard data square you had where if you want to stay in that lower left quadrant, it's a full-time job. What do you call that job in our risk business? Because that's what I do.
Risk data analyst,
Okay.
maybe some places data scientists, those sorts of things. But that comes back to, again, if we want to evolve as a profession, really be data driven, really leverage our opportunities here, we have to recognize there's an expenditure associated with a cost. But that cost is offset by the fact that we no longer chase the ghosts we chase today and do stupid stuff, because as a profession, frankly, some of the things we do, if you really analyze it, makes no sense whatsoever, but we spend a ton of money on it, right? And we do because we haven't analyzed its value proposition, and it takes that investment in people like yourself to provide management with an understanding and ability to defend a statement, maybe saying to a regulator or an auditor, we're not doing that this year because this is more important. Here's the analysis that supports that, right? Those opportunities, again, if I had more time, I could give you some stories about how I, as a CISO, saved my organization literally millions of dollars by being able to do this sort of thing and defended it successfully to regulators and auditors. So, any other questions? Yes? What advice do I have on model complexity versus model simplicity? One of the advantages I had in developing FAIR is that I had two advantages. One, I was a practicing CISO who it couldn't be a science project. I had to use it, and I had to explain it, and I had to understand it. It could not be horribly complex. And two, I don't have a deep math background. I could not apply all these profound, mathematical functions and that sort of thing. But here's the deal, you don't need to. I mean, when we've had PhDs examine FAIR in various companies and such and do model risk management around it, and they're always thrilled at its intuitive, straightforward manner, and that makes it pragmatic for, normal people like me to use, right? So if somebody puts a risk model in front of you that it requires a PhD to understand it, it's not necessary, and B, those tend to be really fragile and very specific to certain parameters or characteristics of what's being measured. So there's a lot of hazard there. Other questions? Yes? they're going to hook me here in a second.
Yeah, Volker Strecke from Arrow. You probably did go a little too fast about the, in my opinion, most important slide. What would be the first steps in doing and
Yeah,
quantified
I
risk
apologize,
management? What would be the first steps? Again, the question for a beginner who is asking these questions
Yep.
about how do I quantify and how do I then, as a second question, how do I prioritize the respective actions which are needed, for example, in order to better secure a critical infrastructure, such as, for example.
Great questions. I apologize again for skipping over some of that. So there are some really good resources available on the FAIR Institute around sort of getting started, white papers and that sort of thing. I've just created it's in an editing process, a guide for adopting FAIR within an organization and sort of the steps involved with that. So without getting into the details, there are some really good resources out there. I wrote a book a couple years ago, co-authored a book on FAIR and how to do it, and it steps you through how to do this stuff in great and gory detail. So the information's out there, and if you want to, anybody who's interested in more, I'll be out there and you can pick my brain. Again, I apologize. All right, that's it. Thank you. I hope you found this useful. So.